All right. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our first in-person Civil War Roundtable of 2022. Seems like only, what was that, August that we did this last? My name is Adam Vance. I'm the Assistant Director of the Library and Archives. And can't hear me?
I can't hear you.
Okay,
Get closer to the mic.
get closer to the mic.
There you go.
Better. Okay. All right. I can also adjust that. All right. Is that better? Yeah. Somewhat. Okay. Before I let Scott Rosenau introduce Scott Mingus, I just wanted to go through a handful of events that we're hosting over the next few weeks, starting with a week from tonight on April 27th. We'll be welcoming the All Vets organization, and they will be hosting Bob Gladfelter, who served in the Air Force in the Avionics Communications Repair Area in Okinawa, Japan, in the closing days of the Vietnam War. On May 1st, All Vets takes place at 7:00 p.m. for those who have not attended. On May 1st at 2:30, that's Sunday, May 1st, the South Central Pennsylvania Genealogical Society will be presenting Tyler Stump of the Pennsylvania State Archives, who will be discussing researching the history of institutionalized people in Pennsylvania. And he will be presenting what kinds of information can be found in the collections of the Pennsylvania State Archives, which is the repository for many of the records of mental institutions. On May 6th, that is Friday, May 6th, we will be participating in Give Local York. And the History Center obviously will be asking for your generous support, but we will be providing free admission to our sites, including here in the Historical Society Museum. We also have various events scheduled throughout the day, which are posted on our website. And library staff will be available in the lobby of the Historical Society Museum to help people who are interested in Ancestry.com or in scanning family documents and photographs. So that'll be something we're providing for the public on May 6th. So I'll turn things over to Scott Rosenau.
Thank you, Adam. Again, I want to welcome everyone back to our first in-person meeting since last year. We're glad to have Scott Mingus, our presenter tonight, local favorite, and very looking forward to his program tonight on the Lincoln funeral train. As we look forward to next month, we have an interesting topic, a little bit different than some other ones that we've had. It's going to be about the geology of the Gettysburg campaign. It's going to discuss about how the landscapes and geology of the area were important to the battle, with the Confederates coming through South Mountain, Union migrating north through the Piedmont, and both sides seeking the easiest routes. And once in Gettysburg, the terrain was varied as sedimentary rocks were underlying the lowest elevations, the hard igneous rocks held up the higher ground, and they learned quickly that digging trenches wasn't possible and that they had to pile up stones for defense. And the speaker is Jerry Jones, who owns the Geological Services in Spring Grove. And he received his BS in geoarchaeology from Catawba College in Salisbury, North Carolina. And in his 43 years of research, he leads groups on field trips and acts as a consultant to several area quarries. And he's traveled throughout the country conducting field trips and programs for all ages. He's taught at Pack in Gettysburg and York College, Pennsylvania. And he's currently on the faculty at Messiah University. So we look forward to an interesting presentation next month about how geology fits into the history of the Civil War. So without further ado, we're going to introduce our local favorite. We're going to introduce Scott Mingus as he talks about his new book about the Lincoln funeral train in Pennsylvania. And from what I understand, what he told us before the program is that today is actually the anniversary, tomorrow is the anniversary of when the train passed through York, Pennsylvania. So without further ado, here's Scott Mingus.
Can everybody hear me okay? Yeah. Well, thank you again, Scott, for that warm welcome. Thank you to everybody who came out tonight. What a great crowd. We appreciate you very much coming today. We certainly encourage you to continue to support the roundtable in the months and years to come. Tonight, I want to talk to you about, Scott mentioned, my newest book, which is on the Lincoln funeral train. Many years ago, I was a senior at Miami University looking for jobs in the pulp and paper industry, and ended up settling actually got a great job. But it was along the railroad. I lived along the railroad tracks near Cleveland, Ohio, while I worked for a company called Avery Dennison. From our back door, we could sit on the porch and look at the exact same tracks, same right away at least, that Abraham Lincoln's funeral train came on in April 28, 1865. That sparked a lifelong interest in the Lincoln funeral train. That finally culminated with me taking the time over the winter during all the COVID shutdowns to write a book about that subject. So let's get started. As we all know, Abraham Lincoln went to see a play on April 14th on Good Friday evening. Our American Cousin at Ford's Theater and John Wilkes Booth, a man with connections here in York County, in fact, fired the bullet that would eventually kill the president. He would die in the morning of April 15th at the Peterson House across the street from Ford's Theater. News arrived here in York, as it did in most places in the country, via telegram, and people were stunned. People were quite shocked. An American president had not been killed, although there had been assassination attempts previously on presidents. But Lincoln was the first one to actually truly be killed by an assassin's bullet. That left quite a bit of scrambling. And the part that people miss about the Lincoln assassination is everything that went on in the week between Lincoln's assassination and the start of his trip home. One of the early issues was Mary Todd Lincoln, of course, was quite distraught over the whole idea. Her husband was dead. She'd already lost 2 sons in the war, lost other friends. Family members had died serving in the Confederate Army. Another would soon die at Chickamauga that fall. So Mary wasn't in the best mental state at that point in time. So Robert Todd Lincoln worked with the United States War Department to start thinking about what are we going to do about the president's body. We need to get it buried somewhere. And there were certainly people who thought that Lincoln should have been buried in Washington. But Mrs. Lincoln and Robert Todd Lincoln, together with other people they were consulting with and other family members, decided that it was best to send him back to Washington, from Washington to their home in Springfield, Illinois. Now, the Lincolns had moved in 1861 from Springfield. They had sold some of their possessions, rented out their house, and they'd always planned on going back to Springfield at some point in the future. Mary now has to make the hard decisions again in her state of grief as to what are we going to do at the point in time. And the first thought was, let's semi-replicate how Lincoln came to Washington in the first place in 1861 via rail. So the plans were to start repeating this. If you look on the map, back in 1861, Lincoln had left Springfield. He had went to Indianapolis, down to Cincinnati, up to Columbus, to Cleveland, to Pittsburgh, up to Buffalo. Now the return trip is going to be a little bit different because Chicago was not on the agenda in 1861. Chicago is very much in play now. In fact, the mayor of Chicago, almost all of city council, and many of the leading citizens of Chicago have hired their own special train. They've come to Washington, D.C. They've met with the War Department, and they have insisted that Chicago be now part of the formal planning for Lincoln's final trip home. If you're going to go to Chicago, something's going to be given, and of course, that will be Pittsburgh and Cincinnati at that point in time. But most of this is going to pretty much replicate what Lincoln was going to do in 1861, now that he's going back to Springfield in 1865. Mrs. Lincoln decides they want to dig up William Wallace Lincoln, send his body along with his father to also be buried in Springfield. Now, there's a lot of family and friends. Abraham Lincoln, by the way, does not have a single blood relative on the funeral train. The family and friends are his friends and blood relatives of Mary Todd Lincoln. There are also going to be 29 bodyguards, injured soldiers from across the United States in their light blue uniforms, members of the Veterans Reserve Corps. Of course, being a military procession and Lincoln being the executive chief of the United States Armed Forces, there will be senior military officials from both the Army and the Navy on board. And of course, Congress always has to get involved, and Congress said, we're going to send our own people on the train. And of course, the congressmen are also going to have to come with their pages, their secretaries, anyone else that's coming with them. And now you can just see this is getting bigger and bigger by the minute. Chicago, of course, has got their delegation. Springfield's got their mayor and a number of other Lincoln's friends and former law partners and things are in the mix as well. And of course, since this is going to be one of the few times in American history at that point you've transported a body that far, they are going to embalm Lincoln's body, which means the embalmer and the undertaker will also need to be on board the train because plans are to display Lincoln's body at multiple locations throughout the United States, the North at least, on the return trips, at least once in every major state. At least that's the initial plan, -1. And of course, because this is a huge media event, reporters from Chicago, Philadelphia, New York, and Boston, as well as 2 reporters from the Associated Press will be on board. Add all that up, folks, and you're talking about close to 100 to 150 people, maybe more, that want to ride the Lincoln funeral train. That's going to let the government to make another key decision about this route. And that's the fact that every single leg of this, each railroad involved will have to supply its own locomotive, its own tender, and 6 at least passenger cars. The government will provide Lincoln's funeral car. They will provide a special car for the family and friends, and they will provide a baggage car that the Baltimore, Ohio is going to provide for the trip. Everything else has to be provided by the post railroad that's going to take the trip. Now, this is Lincoln's coffin. It's 6'6". He barely squeezes into it, but he does fit. Lincoln coffin will cost $1,500. Now, in today's world, we're familiar with Marine One and Air Force One that are the aerial conveyances the president has. Back in those days, the president did not have a designated mode of transportation. There was a carriage, of course, they used around Washington, but as far as long trips goes, and the government had started to rectify that by building a dedicated rail car that would be used by the senior executive, as well as any other members of the executive or legislative branches or Congress that needed it. So this vehicle on the right was named United States, was built in Alexandria, Virginia, was completed in 1864, and Lincoln was supposed to ride on it on April 22nd. He, of course, did not get to take that train ride. He's dead. So Lincoln would never get the experience of physically actually seeing this car. Government workers at Alexandria hastily convert this into a funeral car. They strip out some of the furniture that's inside. They put in a catafalque or a platform, if you will, for the coffin to reside on. They strip out other furniture to make room for William Wallace Lincoln's body as well. They decorate the car so it's now draped in black. They take down all the bright furnishings that were in there, including the green window shades and curtains, and they change it all over. With that, it's now time to send the president off from Washington. On April 18th, Lincoln will be lying in state in the executive mansion, well, called the White House, of course, back then commonly known as the president's house or as the executive mansion. He's going to lie in state there. Nothing's going to happen of any substance on the 19th. And on the 20th, they are going to move Lincoln's body to the Capitol Rotunda. He will be on display for the public throughout the day of April 20th. The following morning is where our story begins. 160 17 years ago, President Lincoln's train will leave Washington for the final time. It's going to leave from here. This is the Baltimore, Ohio's train station in downtown Washington. That was the corner of New Jersey Avenue and C Street Northwest. Now a park is nearby. You can see the location here. Here's the Capitol building. So this is a very short trip to the Baltimore, Ohio's railroad depot. There is, of course, a York County connection. It's long been said that all roads lead to York. Even in the Lincoln funeral, roads lead to York. Carolus Miller from Hanover, some accounts say he's the engineer of the engine, but if you go back and actually read the original accounts, he's the fireman on the Baltimore and Ohio locomotive that is going to take the body from Washington, D.C. to Baltimore. It's about a 2-hour trip. This is what an artist says it looked like inside. Here, of course, is the catafalque down here. Here's Lincoln's coffin. There are 3 officers in the military that are accompanying him. This is in the front room of the car. The middle room is a sitting room, and then the final room, it's a 3-room car, contains the coffin of William Wallace Lincoln. So this is the interior of it. Train's going to arrive at Camden Yards. She's going to take Lincoln's body to the Merchant Exchange in downtown Baltimore. And over the course of the next 2 hours or 3 hours, you'll have 10,000 people braving a light rain in downtown Baltimore for a glimpse of President Lincoln's remains. Once that's finished, while that's going on, by the way, they have moved Lincoln's funeral car, the baggage car, and the family car, which is a board of directors car for the Philadelphia, Wilmington, and Baltimore Railroad. They've taken those 3 cars through the inner harbor and they've moved them to Calvert Station right here, which is the Northern Central Railway Station. And so the train is reconstituted. All these congressmen get back on board. The honor guard brings Lincoln's body back on board, and they're ready to go. Now, the government had also said 3 things about the funeral train as it was going to leave. Number 1, as a train came to a state line or to the first major stop in a new state, the governor of that state would take over the train symbolically. So as they stop in Baltimore, the governor of Maryland, Augustus Bradford, symbolically takes over the train. Now, Bradford is a Democrat. Lincoln, of course, is a Republican, but Bradford is somewhat of a rarity. He is a governor who is a war Democrat, meaning the fact that he supports President Lincoln's policies on persecuting the war to its closure. Bradford, of course, is worked very closely with Lincoln and the administration throughout his years. He will now take charge of the train. The second thing the government decrees is that all traffic on the railroads on which the funeral train is to go must vacate the tracks and go onto a siding or be off of the premises 30 minutes before the train arrives, 30 minutes after the train arrives. So in essence, for a 1-hour window, all traffic on that particular railroad in the vicinity of the Lincoln funeral train must halt. The third thing that the government does, and perhaps the most interesting of all, is it requires each railroad to provide a pilot train. Typically a locomotive, a tender, and 1 passenger car. That pilot train, usually decked out in black mourning attire, often with Lincoln's picture on the cowcatcher or just above it. Those pilot trains were to go 10 minutes before the Lincoln funeral train was to leave. Now, there's 2 reasons the government states for that. Number 1 is to give a 10-minute warning to every community that it arrives. Okay, set your watches because in 10 minutes, the president's funeral train is going to come by. The other reason, as you'll see as we go through our slides, is because there's some very, very dangerous bridges on Lincoln's route. Not ordinarily dangerous, but in the hands of a saboteur, these bridges could be quite nasty. Keep in mind, at this stage, after the massive attack on the United States government, nobody's really certain how deep and how widespread the plot is against Lincoln. Does it involve the Confederate government? Some fear. Others fear that there's a network of spies in sympathy to Booth and his colleagues. And what better way to take revenge than to drop Congress, if you will, several members of Congress and Lincoln's body symbolically off a bridge by destroying the bridge or weakening the bridge. And so every engineer of these pilot trains, I'm sure, realized that you're the guinea pig. If the bridge is going to go down, we're going to take the pilot train down, and we're not going to take the funeral train down. And so that will be, unfortunately, painfully obvious to some of the reporters that that is a hidden meaning. So the Lincoln funeral train is due to leave Baltimore at 3 p.m. You probably can't read from there. It's going to arrive in York County at 5:20. It's going to get to Harrisburg at 8:30. So this is the presumed timetable, which they're going to follow roughly as they go through it. Now, unlike some towns and some cities where we know the names of many of the key personnel that are involved in the Lincoln funeral train, what we don't know here in York County is the identity of the actual locomotive. Most accounts suggest it was one of two 460 locomotives that the Northern Central Railway had purchased earlier that year. This is one of the two. So I have a 50-50 shot that that's the locomotive that pulled Lincoln's funeral train through York County. Probably not, because usually for me 50-50 means 10-90, and usually wrong. But that could be. If not, it's identical to the locomotive. We do know the name of the engineer here in York County. It's Gardner Cobb of Reading. He will have the honors of doing this. And we do also know the name of the conductor in York County. It's William Henry Harrison Gould. In fact, this is his very badge that he wore on the train, Northern Central Railway conductor with the black, that's a picture of Lincoln in black rosette. And that is the conductor's badge that would have been worn. This is in the collection of the Dauphin County Historical Society up in Harrisburg. Yeah, so the train will leave Baltimore. We'll come through Lutherville. This is the Lutherville Girls Academy, female academy. There, a number of young ladies dressed in mourning clothes will be alongside the railroad tracks that ran right in front of the seminary. And they are mourning the passage of Lincoln. Train, of course, will continue a little farther north, going through Cockeysville. We'll head through Parkton into Freeland, and we'll finally arrive at Summit Number 1. This is Summit Number 1, now known as New Freedom. This is just south of New Freedom. The actual New Freedom stop itself. Governor Bradford will symbolically turn the train over to Governor Andrew Curtin of Pennsylvania, a distant relative of Kathy's, if I recall. Andrew Gregg Curtin is a Republican. Of course, he is probably the most powerful Republican governor in the country at this point in time. He's also politically a good friend of Augustus Bradford. They had worked hand in hand during the 1864 invasion of Maryland by Jubal Early, culminating, of course, in the Battle of Monocacy. And then so Bradford and Curtin knew each other, worked very carefully together, and Curtin extends the honor to Bradford. Don't leave the train. You may ride with me if you so choose, all the way up into Harrisburg. They will sit together in a car, in which one reporter will later quote, "This is the first time I've seen relations from Maryland and Pennsylvania to be this good for almost a lifetime." Again, realizing that we fought a war against Maryland way back when, Cresap's War, and the relationships have never super been strong between the two states. And now here is a visible emblem of these two governors having a strong conversation together. Train will then leave, head through Shrewsbury Station on through Glen Rock. A telegraph operator in Glen Rock will send a message on to York that the train has now passed here. Remember, the pilot train has already passed through 10 minutes earlier. At Hanover Junction, Abraham Lincoln will pay the second visit of his life to Hanover Junction. His first time he's alive. And back in November 18th, 1863, Lincoln's train would have made a left-hand turn at Hanover Junction and would have went on to Gettysburg after a lengthy delay while it was waiting on Governor Curtin's train to come down from Harrisburg. This time, of course, there will not be a left turn to Gettysburg. The Lincoln funeral train will not stop. It will proceed through. Now, the funeral train by government orders will travel approximately 20 miles an hour, through the open countryside, about 10 miles an hour through populated areas or areas of significant switches such as Hanover Junction. So we believe, we don't have proof of it, that the train will slow down to about 10 miles an hour at Hanover Junction. But here, as in Glen Rock, as in Shrewsbury Station, et cetera, you will have large concentrations of mourners standing in the ever increasing rain, taking off their hats in respect for the office of the presidency of the United States. At Shrewsbury Station, by the way, I should mention, is the first time that the reporters record a racially mixed group of mourners. Shrewsbury Station, men black and white, young and old, male and female, have assembled at Shrewsbury Station to watch the train go by. They do not make that comment at any other point on the first day of the funeral train's trip. Train's going to go through the Howard Tunnel. Of course, this is another area of concern here in York County. In fact, in 1863, there were concerns about the Howard Tunnel being sabotaged by the Confederate Army. And those concerns are still present, that perhaps somebody could try some mischief at the Howard Tunnel. Nothing's going to happen, but again, there are reports of guards being stationed in and around the Howard Tunnel. And it's going to go through approximately 617. Hard to see, by the way, it's an old picture, but here comes a locomotive actually heading from the south to the north through the tunnel. The train's finally got to arrive here in York at about 6:40 p.m. It's a little bit late when it arrives, partially again because of the crowds. They've slowed down a few more times than they originally planned on, but they're going to pull into York. As they start coming in here to town, the United States Army Hospital on Penn Common in downtown York, under the command of Major St. John Minzer. He and his staff have assembled their soldiers again in their light blue uniforms along the railroad tracks to greet the funeral train as it rolls into downtown York. There will also be cannons, small signal cannons firing what are known as minute tributes. Small blasts to mournfully announce again the arrival of the Lincoln funeral train. All the bells here in York are muffled, and so church bells, etc., will play mournful dirges, if you will. There will be a choir that will sing as the funeral train rolls into York as well. Again, keeping in mind that York County was not an area that supported Lincoln by any stretch of the imagination. In fact, one resident of Round Hill, Pennsylvania, when told that Lincoln had been assassinated, remarked famously, served him right, he should have been shot long ago. And that's kind of the attitude of a lot of folks, but there's still people pouring out from their homes to get a glimpse of the funeral train. Now, it's regularly scheduled to have a 5-minute water stop here in York. That's going to get stretched out to 10 minutes because a group of York's women, YCHC has this picture. Thank you, Adam. This is Isabella Small. She is the wife of Samuel Small. She will lead a delegation of 5 other women onto the train. They will present a very large 3-foot wide wreath. This is a replica from a reenactment a few years ago, a York Daily Record photograph showing a reenactor portraying Mrs. Small as they bring this wreath on board the train. This is the first time that the government has allowed people from the outside onto the Lincoln funeral car. It happens here in York. Did not happen in Baltimore that I can find or in Washington, but it does happen here in York. This would have been the train station built in May of 1863. This is the only known photograph that I've seen of the Civil War train station here, dug out of the archives. But this gives you a flavor. And this, never seen this picture before. This is Aquila Howard. He is a black man, a servant of Philip Albright Small, and he and his family have been watching the events, and the Smalls, Mrs. Small, will invite him on board the train, and symbolically, an African-American man born in Maryland will put the wreath from York citizens onto the coffin of Abraham Lincoln here in York. The train will then proceed north, will head through Goldsboro, etc., York Haven, and will arrive in New Cumberland. From there, it'll make a right-hand turn onto the wooden bridge, and we'll go into downtown Harrisburg. By now, it's almost dark. The skies are very threatening. It's horrible, horrible evening weather-wise. The winds are picking up. Now, all throughout downtown Harrisburg, as in downtown York, people have decorated their homes with black crepe or black cloth of different sorts. There are signs up, there are posters supporting the president, honoring his memory, and the train rolls in just as the storm gets worse. And these signs start blowing around Harrisburg, and black cloth starts flying in the air as these 40 to 45, sometimes 50-mile-an-hour wind gusts hit in downtown Harrisburg. This is the funeral train, by the way, as it arrives in threatening clouds as it comes in on April 21st. They're going to take the body down Market Street. We do not have a single photograph of Abraham Lincoln's funeral procession in Harrisburg, not one. Why? Because the storm hits with a vengeance, just as the funeral train is, or funeral cortege is starting off. In fact, it's so bad, thunder, wicked lightning, unbelievable torrents of rain. And believe it or not, the sewer system of Harrisburg backs up. And now Harrisburg is a wet, soggy, stinky mess. And the last thing you want to do is have Lincoln's body out there. And if you're a photographer, you most definitely aren't going to stand still in a lightning storm to try to expose. So we have no photographs of what happened. All we know is we got the president's coffin finally arrives at the state capitol. They're going to, the honor guard's going to take the body out. They're going to put Lincoln's body onto the catafalque inside the state capitol building. And they're going to dress Lincoln up a little bit, have the embalmer and the undertaker do some last minute repairs to Lincoln's face. And then they're going to open it to the public for this viewing. While the undertaker is doing his thing, they will actually put this very handkerchief on Abraham Lincoln's dead face in Harrisburg while they're presenting the body and making sure that they're dusting it, making sure his clothes look clean, etc. And then they take off the handkerchief and they will powder his face. They will actually chalk it, believe it or not, to make it look a little bit better, and then put rouge, etc., to make it look somewhat better. But that very handkerchief, again, that's probably the last recorded handkerchief to ever touch Abraham Lincoln's face. Again, it's in the collection of the Dauphin County Historical Society. It can be viewed at the John Harris Simon Cameron Mansion on Front Street in Harrisburg, currently on display. They had a big display on presidential visits to Pennsylvania. That was April 21st. Lincoln's body is repaired again overnight, and now April 22nd. To the state capitol, Mayor Augustus Rumford, a French immigrant, will personally open the doors. The 2 hours the public's allowed in. 10,000 people are in line. Most of them will never see Lincoln's body. They've waited in the rain in many cases overnight, but because it's only open for 2 hours and the line's moving rather slowly, they're not going to get everybody through there. Because at 9 o'clock, they're going to boot out all the public, and of course, the politicians are going to take over. And so Pennsylvania's Supreme Court and Pennsylvania state senators and representatives and various other dignitaries from around Pennsylvania, including military officers from our local army bases, et cetera, are going to be allowed to view Lincoln's body. At 10 o'clock, they hustle them out as well, because above all else, this is a railroad, and we've got a schedule to be met. Hang the government, we need to get the train on the road. While that's going on, of course, they've now hooked up the funeral car, the baggage car, and the family car to a Pennsylvania railroad train. We know a lot about this train. Locomotive number 331 with engineer John Edward Miller. This is the catafalque, by the way, in the state capitol. Again, we don't have a single photograph of the coffin on the catafalque that I've ever seen. May be out there, but I personally haven't seen it. We have a lot of pictures of the catafalque itself. This is the Lincoln funeral train preparing to leave Harrisburg. This is sometimes mistakenly pictured as being on April 21st. This photograph is taken on the morning of April 22nd. Why? Because there's still light out. When the funeral train arrives on the 21st, it's dark and stormy. This is the morning of the 22nd. And of course, you can see Pennsylvania Railroad, if you can read right here. These are the PRR cars, so it's already been hooked up. Remember, if this is the 21st, this will be the Northern Central train, but this is the 22nd. This is the PRR's train ready to go. Okay, this is again another view of 331 Pennsylvania Railroad train. This is the funeral car, and this is the baggage or the family cars. Due to leave Harrisburg at 11 o'clock in the morning, they're going to get off at about 11:15, due into Philadelphia at 4:30. Here's one of these bridges. Remember I talked about the pilot train. Why you want a pilot train? Somebody want to sabotage that bridge? What do you think that'll do to the United States Congress that's on board, as well as several major generals and brigadier generals, including two heroes at Gettysburg, John Caldwell, for example, and John Gibbon. General Gibbon, of course, later will be involved in the Little Bighorn campaign in 1876. But Gibbon and Caldwell are on board this train, as well as leading admirals and people like that. And so you definitely do not want to drop that train into the drain. In this case, over the Colorado River. Elizabethtown, I'll be signing books this Friday on the exact anniversary of the train going through Elizabethtown. So it'll be there at 12:11 as it goes through Elizabethtown, rolls into Lancaster. As the train approaches Lancaster, sitting in his carriage off to the side is James Buchanan, former president of the United States, mourning by himself, perhaps with his driver, maybe one other person come to him. Reporters on board will notice the carriage. They will also see Wheatland off in the distance, and everybody will clearly recognize this as James Buchanan. Now the train rolls into downtown Lancaster. 10,000 people in Baltimore, 10,000 people in Harrisburg, 20,000 in Lancaster. Partially because now you're getting into Republican country. Maryland was Democrat, Baltimore County is Democrat, York County was Democrat. Now you're into heart and soul of Republican country, and the crowds are massive. Lancaster is not a very big town, folks, and yet 20,000 people cram into Lancaster. Train will stop for 10 minutes in Lancaster. They have trouble actually stopping the train. So many people, especially small girls and other school children, have tossed so many flowers onto the tracks that the locomotive can't slow down when it wants to. And it actually will slide through the actual stopping point and will continue on to short distance before Miller is finally able to get the train to a complete halt in downtown Lancaster. This again is a 10-minute stop for water and fuel, and again, a delegation of women from Lancaster come on board. Now, I don't know much about York and Lancaster's history against each other, other than these baseball teams that don't necessarily like each other. But I can just picture the ladies in my mind, the ladies coming on and seeing that York's flowers are on Lincoln's coffin. And on comes Lancaster's flowers. Because we do know what they officially say is the Patriot Daughters of Lancaster do put their flowers on top of Lincoln's coffin. Now, maybe York's flowers were already gone. Remember, they've already taken the body off, of course, in downtown Harrisburg. The actual whereabouts of York's flowers disappears to history. We do not know if they went all the way to Springfield with the body. Probably not, but we don't know what happened to it. As the train leaves, it goes by a number of factories. It goes over the Conestoga Bridge right here underneath this pier. And it stands a forlorn, lonely figure by himself. No hat on, no coat. It's Thaddeus Stevens. Stevens, of course, had worked closely with President Lincoln on the passage of the 13th Amendment just a few months before Lincoln's assassination. They had been celebrating what they hoped would be a first step towards reconstructing the country. And now Lincoln's dead, and Thaddeus Stevens is standing there mournful by himself. And again, reporters very clearly recognize this man. He's widely known among the media that's been covering the Lincoln administration who are on board the train. And they again report, multiple people report seeing Thaddeus Stevens standing there. Now, when it reaches Gap, this is the train tracks here at Gap. This is the freight station. Here's the passenger station. If you see this field right here, Pennsylvania Railroad had parked most of its trains. Remember that 30-minute window before and after the Lincoln funeral train arrived. most of the PRR's trains have been parked in Gap. So they're not letting it go to Lancaster, or they're not letting it go to Philadelphia. And so that field, would have, as several eyewitnesses report, was filled with mourners who had gotten off their trains and are now lining that field for a glimpse of the Lincoln funeral train again, 10 miles an hour as it steams through Gap. Here's another bridge they got to be concerned about. This is Coatesville. Just going into Coatesville, of course, another nasty surprise. That's Westchester, Pennsylvania. Anybody been to Westchester? Doesn't look like that today, does it? By any stretch of imagination. That's what Westchester would have looked like back during the Civil War. So it was a pretty remote little out of the way place. Funeral train's going to arrive in West Philadelphia at the Pennsylvania Railroad Station at 4:30-ish, running late. As with happened in York, 4 people here in York we know of put pennies on the railroad tracks here in York and kept those pennies that have been squashed by the Lincoln funeral train the rest of their lives. We don't know whatever happened to those pennies. Perhaps the family still have it. In Philadelphia, though, they have one of these pennies that somebody put on the tracks has been preserved all these years. 4 p.m. from Harrisburg, arrive at Pennsylvania Station. Pennies run over by Lincoln's funeral train, April 22nd, 1865. So that is the only known surviving penny squashed by the funeral train that's on public display. But they're not stopping the PRR station because they want to go to downtown Philadelphia. So they're going to go to the Philadelphia, Wilmington, and Baltimore station. Again, a photograph that's often erroneously, it's actually in books, erroneously marked as the Baltimore station in Baltimore. That's not obviously Calvert Station. That's not Camden Yards. That is right across the street from the train station on South Broad Street. And when people talk about the Baltimore station, they're talking about the Philadelphia, Wilmington, and Baltimore Railroad, because that station in Philadelphia was called the Baltimore Depot. So this picture, in almost every book you ever see, it shows it as being in Baltimore. It's not, it's in Philadelphia. Why? Because Ridgway Glover took that picture. Even people say Ridgway Glover photographed. Ridgway Glover is a photographer in Philadelphia who takes a number of other photographs that day in Philadelphia, including this one. This one shows, look at the elaborate, here's Lincoln's funeral, this is his coffin. Look at that hearse, pulled by these magnificent horses through the streets of Philadelphia. Here's the route it's going to go. It's going to go up Broad Street, it's going to turn on Walnut, head up on 69th, down on Mulberry, and we'll finally come to Independence Hall. Again, here are some more Ridgway Glover's photographs, not in Baltimore, but in downtown Philadelphia. This one I love. Major General Hancock's recruiting station. This late in the Civil War, they're still trying to get soldiers to join the U.S. Army. And Winfield Scott Hancock himself, a Pennsylvanian. Hancock is, I don't know if he was a Pennsylvanian at that point, but he lived and worked in Philadelphia briefly. And they have this recruiting parlor here. Again, you can see this magnificent hearse, and of course here is the Lincoln coffin on that in these photographs. There's actually a nice painting done again based on one of Glover's photographs, showing again, here's the coffin with red roses on top of it. It goes by Union League, who commissioned this picture. That evening, again, more photographs of the procession that Glover took. This is one of the few surviving tickets. You had to have a ticket to get in that night in Philadelphia for the first event. You had to get that from the mayor or members of the city council. Usually they were reserved for the Republicans, who were the strong supporters of Mayor Alexander Henry and his people. Alexander Henry has 187th Pennsylvania, including many men from York County who served as an honor guard in Philadelphia for them. They were stationed at Camp Cadwalader, and they were given the honor of escorting the body in Philadelphia. This private viewing of the tickets will last till about midnight. And again, you're going to have to doctor up Lincoln's body overnight. They actually take the body to an undertaker's place overnight in Philadelphia. And the undertaker, working with the United States government undertaker and the embalmer, will fix Lincoln up for the next day. Why? Because all day long on the 21st and 22nd, train loads have been arriving in Philadelphia. 10,000 people in Baltimore, 5,000 people in York, 10,000 people in Harrisburg, 20,000 people in Lancaster. How many do you think came to Philadelphia? 300,000 people came to Philadelphia. Some newspaper accounts say 500,000. Philadelphia becomes the single largest stop on the entire Lincoln funeral train. Massive amounts of people were there to see the train. It will be at its peak 3-hour or 3-mile long wait. Can you imagine standing in Philadelphia in a hoop skirt and petticoats in the heat, because now it's hot and humid on this day, waiting in line to get to see Lincoln's body? It is an absolute mess in Philadelphia. Like I said, the line stretches for 3 miles. And of course, it's Philadelphia. And people get impatient and they start arguing and they want their place in line, and people start elbowing. And pretty soon, 2 little boys have their arms broken and women have their clothing in tatters as people are now shoving and they're pushing each other out of the way because I want to get in and make sure I see Lincoln's body. The governor of Pennsylvania, Andrew Gray Curtin, shows up at a window inside the 2nd floor of Independence Hall and screams, "We are Penn State." No, he says, "We are Pennsylvanians. We don't act this way." Well, you're Philadelphians, and yes, you do. And nothing's going to happen when the governor pleads his case. He's finally got to call in 1,000 members of the United States military, as well as every single policeman he can get his hands on, and finally close to 1,000 cops and 1,000 soldiers together finally bring this crowd under control. But they're going to let everybody in line see the body. It's not, but you're only going to get 2 seconds. You walk by, and there are men with bayonets to make sure the lines keep moving, because when the army takes over, the army takes over. And the army's going to put people, we don't care if you only see the body. As you walk past, you better look down as you're going by, because we're not going to let you stop. Just keep walking. Well, April 24th, the funeral train is going to leave at 4 o'clock in the morning from Kensington Station. Now on the Philadelphia Trenton Railroad, it's going to cross the river at 5:30, and Governor Joel Parker, a Democrat, a peace Democrat, an anti-Lincoln, can't stand Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln can't stand him. Both of these people, just mutual disaffection. Well, Joel Parker now takes over the train, of course. Andrew Curtin will return back to Harrisburg. But in Trenton, because of the politics, now keep in mind, Scott, you know this, what state was Lincoln's opponent from in 1864? George McClellan, New Jersey. What state voted the most overwhelmingly against Lincoln in 1864? New Jersey. And so the War Department, maybe to thumb their nose at the good state of New Jersey, decides that Trenton will be the only state capital through which the Lincoln funeral train goes where the body will not be put on display. They are not going to allow New Jersey to have the honor of having Abraham Lincoln lying in state of the state capital of what is his #1 political enemy in the entire North, the state of New Jersey. Not going to happen. So what's New Jersey do? They're going to throw their own funeral, minus Lincoln's body. They actually have a hearse. They take the hearse down through the streets, mourning people, again, black clothes, take them to the state capitol. Governor Parker makes speeches, and the Lincoln funeral train is long gone, on its way to Jersey City. Now in Jersey City, this is the Lincoln funeral car, as it's put on a flatboat ferry and taken across the Hudson River into downtown Manhattan, where there's going to be a parade through Manhattan. Again, several photographs exist. See this picture here? See this kid? That's Teddy Roosevelt. Young Teddy Roosevelt and his brother Elliot. In their grandfather, Cornelius Van Schack Roosevelt's house, Teddy Roosevelt will watch the Lincoln funeral train go by his grandpa's front door. And years later, Teddy Roosevelt will remark, this is one of his most vivid childhood memories, seeing Lincoln, the casket of Lincoln, as it goes by on this day in New York City. In New York City, of course, the nation mourns in the City Hall. Again, another fancy hearse. It's too bad we don't have pictures of what the hearse would have looked like in Harrisburg. On April 26th, it goes to Albany. Again, lots of pictures of Albany. On April 28th, it's in Buffalo. Again, you can see all kinds of pictures in Buffalo. And then it's heading towards Erie. Now, originally it was supposed to stop in Erie. Back in 1861, Lincoln's funeral train had stopped at Erie. And in fact, Lincoln had eaten a meal in Erie, Pennsylvania. And the the mayor of Erie is quite dismayed when he finds out the funeral train is not going to stop at Erie. It's going to stop for the night right at the New York border near Northeast Pennsylvania, the name of the town, Northeast. And it's going to spend the night there. Mayor Ferdinand Farrar, God bless this guy, jumps on his own private train, heads across to New York, middle of the night, commandeers the Lincoln funeral train and says, well, you know, Governor Curtin's not here. Remember, when he reached the state line, the governor's supposed to take over the train. I'm representing Governor Curtin. This is now my train. We're going to Erie. And of course, it's the middle of the night in Nowheresville, Pennsylvania. You ever been to Northeast? There's still nothing there. Middle of Nowheresville, Pennsylvania, they can't get a telegraph connection back to Washington in the middle of the night to find out from the War Department, is this Yahoo country bumpkin mayor of Erie, Pennsylvania, does he really have the authority to take the train? Nobody knows how to stop him. And so the train, believe it or not, steams into Erie in the middle of the night. At 3 o'clock in the morning, the mayor orders that the funeral car be opened up to everybody, not just 6 women bringing flowers. And the entire population of Erie, who is dumb enough to be up at 3 o'clock in the morning on a work day, but they are now out there and they will go through the funeral car. This is one of the very few times on the entire funeral train trip where it is recorded that a community is able to come on board the train. 3 o'clock in the morning. I just love this guy. Ferdinand Farrar, the mayor of Erie, PA. They're going to take it on in across the state border into Ohio, where of course Governor Ohio will pick it up. As I mentioned, I lived alongside the railroad tracks, the Cleveland and Erie Railroad. I lived 45 miles east of Cleveland, 32 miles west of Erie, right smack in the middle of Painesville and Mentor, Ohio, where the funeral train will roll through. Pulled by this, the Nashville. April 30th, it goes to Indianapolis. Again, look at that. Then in Chicago, you see why the mayor of Chicago must be a boy. The train's going to pull into that thing, and they're going to unload under the shelter of that. And then finally, on May 3rd, the funeral train arrives. We're very modest first in downtown Springfield. Will escort the bodies of both Willie Lincoln and Abraham Lincoln to their final resting place here in Springfield. Government declared 480 hours of official mourning, 200 hours of scheduled funerals, 12 cities with viewings, 1,654 miles over 17 different railroads. Abraham Lincoln has finally arrived in Springfield, Illinois. But the first place to ever put a flower on Abraham Lincoln's coffin was York, Pennsylvania. Thank you for your time today. Thank you, Adam. Do you have any questions for the audience, or we'll open it up here if we do not?
Not online as yet.
Okay, any questions from the audience? I'll start in the front, Kathy.
Yes, do you want to tell us what happens to the car pulls the unit?
Oh, yes, good question. Question was, for those who may not have heard, is what happens to the Lincoln funeral car? It's actually will be used one time by the government. It will then be sold later in 1865 to Union Pacific, Central Pacific Railroad. It will go out west, will be used as a bunk car for people working on Transcontinental Railroad, et cetera. It will then be taken to the vicinity of, well, it's going to be on display, of course, at various exhibitions, World's Fairs, things like that. But it's finally taken to Minneapolis, Minnesota, where a businessman plans to refurbish it, put it back on public display, and Prairie Fire in 1911 wipes out the Lincoln funeral car. Certain pieces of it are still known to exist. There are some in private collections. There are a couple pieces in the Minnesota Historical Society, pieces of iron, et cetera, that were taken off of the funeral car itself. So, yeah, great question. Yeah, the car doesn't exist anymore. Yeah, there's a question here that I'll get to you.
Scott, with the casket at every stop, there was dissipation open.
Was a casket open for the visitation? Yes. They did at least pull off the faceplate. So you could see, Abraham Lincoln's face as you went through. That's why the undertakers and the embalmers were busy making sure that Lincoln's body looked presentable. Now, it's interesting that Secretary of War Stanton ordered that no one take a photograph of dead Lincoln in his coffin. A photographer in New York City in City Hall managed to sneak a picture of Lincoln's dead body. Stanton was furious. He ordered every single copy of that to be destroyed, except one, which Secretary of War Stanton kept himself. And so now if you go on the internet and do a search for a picture of Lincoln dead in casket, that picture has been widely reproduced over the years. I chose not to put it in my book for various reasons, but I decided not to use it to respect Secretary of War Stanton's wishes that nobody ever view it. But you can find it on the internet. It's really easy to find. Yes.
How many times was his body involved on that?
It was only embalmed once, but the chemicals were touched up multiple times. More importantly, the body was dusted and powdered virtually every stop. And particularly by the time he got to Washington, D.C., Lincoln's body was starting definitely to show the effects. And in multiple locations, they had to double and triple the flower arrangements. When they opened the coffin, go get more flowers. And so they made sure. In fact, keep in mind, this was an era where, you often only display the body a very short period of time in your parlor, and then you bury it as fast as you could. So having a body on public view for 2 weeks, 13 days, was unheard of in the United States at that point in time. So hence, the flower arrangements got bigger, more elaborate, less mournful, and more fragrant. But frequently, by the time they got to Chicago, it was peonies and violets and whatever else you want, cacophony of color, because again, you want the odor, you want the fragrance. Any other questions? Okay.
You have in your book that this gentleman, I have never named Wardhill Lemon.
Yeah.
He's just the close friend and bodyguard, confidant to Lincoln and the marshal in chief of the Connecticut Lodge.
Correct. Yeah, Wardhill Layman was Lincoln's good friend. He was his bodyguard. In fact, back in 1861, there was Wardhill Layman working in conjunction with a Pinkerton agency that had uncovered the suspected plot to kill Abraham Lincoln, hence diverting Lincoln from coming to York on his way to Washington, and he would take a secret PRR train to Philadelphia and then down to Baltimore and on to Washington secretly. So Layman Hill's been with him throughout the time. He had been with him at Gettysburg during the Gettysburg Address. He may or may not show up in the photographs of Lincoln at Hanover Junction, which I still suspect were taken in November 17th, and to show Wardhill Layman and the press train on the day before Lincoln comes, because I can clearly point out Wardhill Layman in those photographs at Hanover Junction. But yeah, he'd been with Lincoln for quite a while. Lincoln had rewarded him in the spring of 1865 by making him the marshal of the District of Columbia. Because the other question people ask is, why wasn't Lincoln's bodyguard, Wardhill Layman, at Ford's Theater? It's because he wasn't Lincoln's bodyguard anymore. He was now the constable of the District of Columbia.
That's what it was.
Yeah. He's a fascinating guy.
So, first you have the story of Lincoln's body being seen in the 20th century by a small group there in Springfield.
Remarkably preserved.
And that's where I'm going with this. It was preserved from all this embalming and everything. My understanding is that the only thing that was on him during the funeral train was a flag, and that flag disintegrated, and with all the problems with the body being moved, and so the body was preserved, but they were wondering about blue and red and white little specks that were all in the body. Do you think that's a true story?
I've heard the same story about the fact that Lincoln was buried with an American flag. as a blanket, if you will, or a covering. And yes, they, according to the news accounts I've read, the same stories, that the disintegrated remnants of the flag were in with the body. And Lincoln's clothes were, of course, badly decomposed, but Lincoln himself was still in fairly good shape. Part of that reason they did that is because Lincoln's body had been stolen, or there had been other attempts to steal Lincoln's body over the years. And so they wanted to make really certain this is Lincoln before they dropped him under, what was it, 26 feet or whatever it was, solid concrete that's now over top of Abraham Lincoln. You're not getting to him now.
That's why Robert.
Right. Yeah. With that, yeah. Scott,
You
go ahead.
you mentioned there were two was it 460, the engine 460? Is that
There were
a
two.
is that a model?
Oh,
number?
sorry, 460 is the number of drive wheels and the number of front wheels, if you will. So at 460, we'll have two sets on the front and then three of this. If I go back to this. We go back here, two little wheels up front, that's four. It's the three big wheels on each side, that's six. And then there's no additional wheels in the back of the car, so 460. And that's just kind of, and Bill knows this far better than I do, but that's the common nomenclature. There was 440 was the most common. Pennsylvania Railroad used a 440, or known as an American style locomotive. But the 460 was actually a little more powerful freight. Northern Central used this to haul freight, not necessarily to haul passengers.
So how much of you said the train was destroyed out in Minnesota?
The funeral car was destroyed in Minnesota.
Okay, so the engine in,
Well, the engines, of course, every single railroad, all 17 of them had their own engines, and they used their engines themselves. Some cases, the locomotives may have been sold off, may have been scrapped. I don't know of any surviving locomotives that can be proven to have been part of the Lincoln funeral train.
the one in E-Town, is that original? or not?
No, that's a replica that was built in Chicago by Clokey, David Clokey Engineering. A couple $1 million or so, but it's a replica, yeah. But it was, they used the original drawings from Alexandria because a friend of mine was involved with procuring and using those, the actual drawings. So it's built to specifications that the government built the car to. So it's as close as a replica as you're ever going to get, but it's only 5 years old, maybe. So, okay, Kat.
You had mentioned in your book, locomotive number 238, Edward H. Jones,
Mhm.
and his tender. Is that one of the Northern Central Railroad?
No, the Edward Jones was the locomotive that Farrar in Erie, after they got done in the middle of the night, they hooked it up to the Edward Jones, and that's the engine they took over to Ohio. So again, each railroad had to provide its own.
Did they commonly name the locomotive?
Some railroads did. Pennsylvania didn't. Pennsylvania Railroad, that's 331. Bill, correct me if I'm wrong. I don't think they started naming locomotives in PRR at that period. So yeah, I think it was. I mean, everything I've ever seen about the PRR simply says locomotive 331. They never name it, but a lot of railroads did. I'm currently writing a book on the Western Maryland Railroad in the Civil War. And they had 4 locomotives in the early part of the Civil War. Patapsco, Western Maryland, Green Spring, and Monocacy. So yeah, they were also naming their locomotives at that period of time. Mhm. Okay, with that, I'll turn it back to you, Adam, if you have any closing remarks, or Scott. Thanks again, everyone.
Us online and here, I'll just say that we're meeting, is it May 18th?
Yes.
Now I forget the day. Thank you, Kathy. So we'll be back on May 18th for our next talk by Jerry Jones, right?
Jerry Jones.
On the geology of Gettysburg. All right. Thanks to everybody online and in person.
Very good. Very good. Thanks, welcome.
Yeah, that's a-
Yeah, I really enjoyed it. I like